Let's talk about the cladding first. Since the Grenfell fire claimed 72 lives in 2017, there's been a huge focus on fire safety in blocks of flats. Yesterday, MPs finally passed the Fire Safety Bill, which clarifies existing law that building owners are responsible for reducing the risk of fire in their properties. But the result has disappointed leaseholders, who will likely have to stump up tens of thousands of pounds to make their flats safe. And this often means the removal of dangerous cladding. The number of people thought to be living in such housing could be up to 600,000. This includes the 300 or so blocks that have the same flammable cladding as Grenfell Tower. Well, in February, the government set aside £3.5 billion to replace unsafe cladding for all leaseholders in residential buildings. Those in lower-rise buildings in England can access a loan to help fund cladding removal, and they'll pay about £50 a month. Now, the House of Lords tried to amend the bill to protect leaseholders from footing the substantial costs of the safety works, but MPs rejected this. Let's hear more from Matt Hodges-Long from the Building Safety Register. Was that a surprise, Matt?
It wasn't a surprise that the bill passed. No, I think with an 80-seat majority, I think it was fairly obvious that it would eventually, but it went down to the wire.
But the Housing Minister last night, Christopher Pincher, said the Lords' plan was inappropriate and unworkable, meaning that you simply can't have taxpayers bailing out that many leaseholders. What do you think of that?
I think where the taxpayer is responsible, or the government, on behalf of the taxpayer, where they've created the problem, then I think it's only fair that the money to remediate these problems should come from the taxpayer. And I think where we can identify that responsibility lies with the builders and the designers of the buildings, then it's only fair for them to pay their fair share of putting this right. I think the key point is that the only party that should not pay for this are the innocent victims of the crisis, people that bought the flats in good faith.
And the argument from the building companies, as I understand it, is nothing that they did at the time was illegal. So if there was a problem, it was the government's problem in drawing up the safety regulations.
Yeah, I think it's a bit of both, really. There will be cases where the builders built in accordance with the building regulations. That's fine. There's a lot of evidence where they haven't built in accordance with the building regulations. So that's why we need to understand on a building by building basis what the root cause of the problem is, and therefore who should pay what percentage of putting it right. The
taxpayer is paying some, even under the new legislation. So tell us what the government setup is. There's a government fund, is that correct?
Yeah, so there's a government fund called the Building Safety Fund, and that's £5.1 billion, which is for buildings over 18 metres or 7 stories, effectively, for their external wall remediation. So that's the only fund at the moment. You mentioned in the intro about the loan scheme. That doesn't actually exist yet. That is an idea with no underlying detail coming forward from the government as yet.
Right, but if that comes in, that would be not for the taller buildings, which are covered, but for people in those shorter buildings, effectively.
Yeah, it's for the middle band, the mid-rise, which the 11 to 18 metre buildings, of which there's about 76,000 of those blocks. And then below 11 metres, so sort of up to about 4 stories in height, there's absolutely no funding solution whatsoever even proposed at the moment. And the government think, they don't know, there's somewhere between 1 and 2 million of those blocks.
One presumes if you live at 4 stories or below, you would be much less worried about fire, though.
You would think so, but there's been a number of fires recently in the last couple of years post-Grenfell. The most recent one was in Arborfield a couple of weeks ago, complete loss of that building. We've had Richmond House in Worcester Park. We've had Barking Riverside. All of these fires are in buildings that are below that magic 11-metre threshold.
So you think that between 1 and 2 million blocks would not be covered as things stand?
Absolutely, but we're not sure about the 1 to 2 million. The government haven't measured how many of these buildings there are, so we're trying to find that out at the moment. But that's the planning assumption they have, is anywhere between 1 and 2 million.
Thank you very much, indeed, Matt Hodges-Long from Building Safety Register. Let's talk to Steph Pike, who lives in a flat in Bristol. And that will have been very disappointing, last night's vote for you, Steph.
Yeah, the vote was extremely disappointing. It was just a bit of a crushing blow to all of us who have campaigned so hard through, a lot of people have been campaigning for 3 years now since Grenfell. And just the Lords fought so hard for us, as did so many backbench MPs and MPs from other parties. But it was such a shame it didn't get through.
Well, there was quite a big rebellion on the Conservative benches, but not enough. Now, your building is it just under the minimum height required for compo? No,
it's actually 19 metres, so just over. Although it has actually been rejected on the basis of height for the Building Safety Fund at the moment. And I think that was an administrative error with the plans that were submitted. So hopefully that will be sorted. But even if we do have a successful application, the fund for the buildings over 18 metres only covers the removal of cladding. It doesn't necessarily cover all of the other fire safety defects that are being discovered. And therefore, that means that leaseholders will still be liable for bills of tens of thousands of pounds to sort out these other defects.
Can you tell us about the costing for your building? How much the total cost? Assuming that you get no compensation, what would the total be?
The total cost that we've applied for the Building Safety Fund is £7.6 million.
Really? And how many people does that have to spread between?
So that's 109 of us. So you're looking at an average of £70,000 per leaseholder.
Good grief.
But, yeah.
So you are hoping that they will realise their mistake with the height of the building and come in and say, you can have half of it at least?
Yes, but anyway, I'm not confident that a lot of it will be covered, or I don't know. There seems to be so many buildings getting rejected on various grounds, and the government say they've put forward all this funding, but they're not releasing it to anyone. And in the meantime, everyone is paying extortionate costs for waking watches, having fire alarms fitted, and this all goes on. And in addition to that, the government has said that no leaseholder will pay more than £50 a month for those who live in buildings under 18 metres. But again, there's no details on the loan scheme. People are paying thousands each month for these interim measures. So it's just not true. And we're not getting the help that we need now, and we need the help right now.
And how is it for you? Because it's nearly 4 years since Grenfell, so that would have been the start of you and your friends in the flats beginning to realise there was a problem, and it's just a lot of stress, I imagine.
Yeah, it's very stressful. It's kind of taking over my life and the life of most people who are involved in this situation, I think. And you kind of live, breathe, and eat cladding at the moment. It's just all consuming, and it's like having a second job.
Thank you very much, Steph Pike, who lives in a flat in Bristol, which it seems doesn't qualify. Let's talk to Peter Cardwell, who's a former special advisor in the Department for Housing and Local Government and author of The Secret Life of Special Advisors. Take us into the minds of the MPs who voted no, if you can, Peter. Why would they not have said to Steph and people in her position, have the money?
I think MPs have a lot of sympathy and realise that people like Steph are going through hell at the moment. But the bill that passed this week wasn't specifically about this. There were amendments put onto it to try and make it about this. What I think the hope for people like Steph, and I think this is going to be sorted out in the building safety bill, which is going to come in a few months. That's going to bring a new regulator, a possible levy on building owners, and that's the time for this debate to be had. Obviously, that's probably no comfort to people like Steph, but this specific bill was about fire safety. It was never about leaseholders' costs. So I think that's the argument the government would have. But listen, I dealt with this when I was at the Ministry of Housing for a year and a half. It's an absolutely horrendous thing that people are involved with. The government is putting a lot of money into this. It needs to be administered better. I totally agree with Steph on that, but it is £5.1 billion of taxpayers' money. And the question is, how much should taxpayers, many of whom can't afford their own home, many of whom don't own a flat, should they be bailing out these buildings, especially when rich developers who put the buildings up in the first place should be liable for those costs, in my view?
Well, I suppose there's two places you can go. If it's not the taxpayer, it's people like Steph who live in the flats, or, as you say, the developers. And what nobody seems to really be able to understand is, because these developers are still in business, why you can't go to them and say, look, we want the money, because this in the end has to come from you.
Some of them are in business, some of them aren't. There are leaseholders who will realise, people like Steph will realise that there are people who builders put up buildings, then they sold them maybe to a shell company, maybe based in the Cayman Islands, and its only asset is that building. So actually pursuing these people and getting them to pay these big businesses and these building owners is very, very difficult. This is a hugely complicated process. It's taking a lot of time. Grenfell, which was a desperate and horrendous tragedy, has really shone a light on the scandal, essentially, of building safety in our country over successive governments over many, many years. And there's a lot to do. And the question is, where does the money come from? And how can people like Steph actually get the justice they need? If you've, scrimped and saved, put a deposit down, bought a nice place, and then suddenly you're hammered with these costs. It's not fair. But the question is how to sort it out, and I'm not sure there's an answer quite yet, but I think the building safety bill coming in a few months will hopefully answer some of those questions for people like Steph and the hundreds of thousands of others who are in this horrendous situation.
Thank you so much, Peter Cardwell, who wrote The Secret Life of Special Advisors and was